Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome for those who are online present, and also welcome to everybody who's physically present here. My name is Shanturu, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to this amazing journey which we've been taking as Greenpeace for quite a while. And today is a big milestone in our journey, that is to bring in a new perspective. And I'm not going to go into too much of those details. I'll stay here with this. And again, enjoy, participate. It's going to be very engaging, a lot of fun. And welcome, and pass on the word. If you have time now, please share it still. There's still time to join. So thank you so much. And I'll pass it on to my director, Valerie.
Thank you, Shanturu. So yeah, welcome everybody live and streaming to Greenpeace's very first panel on ecofeminism. We have gathered some really amazing speakers, and you can already see them behind me. I'm very proud and grateful that they agreed to be here with us, and I will introduce them in a little bit. But first, let's take the opportunity to dive into our topic a little bit. So we at Greenpeace, we recognize that environmental issues are deeply intertwined with issues of social justice, including gender inequality, of course. Ecofeminism is a feminist and environmental philosophy that sees a connection between the oppression of women and the exploitation of the planet and the natural world, as both of those are seen as passive and subordinate in some people's eyes. A commodity, they're both seen as a commodity that can be exploited for materialism and greed. And it has been clear for a long time that women and girls are also disproportionately affected by the climate and biodiversity crisis. Women are often most vulnerable to the effects of those crises, including, for example, water scarcity, deforestation, and also food insecurity. Those problems often hit women first, especially in the global south. That also means that women have a unique perspective on these issues and that they can have a unique contribution to the solution of these issues. Ecofeminism is one of the entry points that we here at Greenpeace use in becoming a more diverse and inclusive organization. By recognizing the ways in which different forms of oppression are connected. Recognizing these connections and linking the fight against the exploitation of the planet with the fight against the exploitation of the people who live on that planet. If we do that, we can join forces and movements, and we can build a more effective movement and a more effective counterpower to implement the changes that we so desperately need to make this place a better world for everybody. So that, very shortly, was an introduction to what we're going to do and our commitment as Greenpeace to diversity and inclusion. And that's also why we have invited these amazing women behind me to further explore this topic of ecofeminism tonight. So let me introduce you to them all. So Philsan Osman is co-author of Who Do We Want to Care For? Ecofeminism as an Inspiration. She studies African languages and cultures at at Ghent University and volunteers for Black History Month, Belgium and Civic Duty. She also writes for the online feminist magazine Spijker Magazine. Philsan is from Somalia and is a writer, activist and community builder. Please give her a warm welcome. Rachida Aziz is a community and movement builder who relentlessly thinks about the entanglement of struggles and develops strategies to influence community and movement building process throughout grassroots practices. She was one of the engines behind the Justice for Mada campaign and the In My Name campaign. Rachida's book, No One Will Sleep Here Tonight, is published by EPO, and I recommend it to all of you. It was a great read. So welcome to Rachida. Joanna Maycock has 30 years of experience in leadership roles in European and international civil society. From 2014 to 2021, she was Secretary General of the European Women's Lobby, the largest alliance of more than 2,000 non-governmental women's organizations in the EU campaigning together for a feminist Europe. In 2019, Joanna was named one of Apolitical's top 100 most influential people in gender policy. Welcome, Joanna. And last but not least, our moderator for tonight, Chloe Mikoljak. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. She is a Brussels-based environmental and social justice activist who is driven by a strong sense of justice and the need to bridge the gap between the grassroots and politics. She's part of several sit-ins collectives and hosts The Burning Case, a podcast that aims to make European politics accessible to a broader audience. Welcome to you as well, and I will gladly pass on the word to you so I can sit back and enjoy the experience. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here in the room and both online. It's going to be a great panel, I'm pretty sure of it, based on the conversations that we've had. And thank you so much, Valerie, for the framing and for leading up with this event. Before we dive into, because there's loads to discuss, just a little bit of technicalities and agenda. So we're going to have a first set of questions until about 4:55, and then there will be a 10-minute break, and you can do whatever you want for the 10-minute break. Then we'll have another round of questions, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. That includes you and people online, and then we'll have a few conclusion words. So, getting into it, environmentalism is not always feminist. I think we can all agree to that, but vice versa, feminism is not always eco-friendly, for a lack of a better word as well. But I wanted to ask you a question. So hopefully online you see a link to a Mentimeter, and hopefully in person you have sort of received the link or you can see it. It is right below. So if you go to menti.com and then you have a code, let me know if in the room I need to give you the code, maybe. And I want to ask you a question, which is a little bit maybe controversial, but it's sort of to set the scene and see what you people think about it. What does ecofeminism mean to you? Hopefully in 1 or 2 words maximum. You don't need to write a whole sentence. People in the room, do you need the code? Yeah? Okay, so it's 73008 6514. Let me know if you need it again. Yeah? Okay. Let's do it again. 7308 6514. All good? Okay. So we'll see words appearing as they come. Empowerment, ecology, exchange, intersectionality, lift up society. Empowerment is growing. Let's give a few more seconds and then I'll ask you obviously what your definition is and maybe reaction to a few words that you see on there, whether you agree, disagree. Let's see. We've got revolution that just appeared. Love. Interesting. Nature and people first. Smashing capitalist patry, which I'm guessing is patriarchy. Yeah. Interspecies, turning into our nature. Ooh. Some really cool stuff appearing here. Okay. Keep them coming if you want. They'll keep appearing on the screen. And I'm going to turn to your speaker to ask you, what does ecofeminism mean to you? Bit of a controversial question maybe to start. Maybe you can start with Philsan.
Oh, so, okay. What does ecofeminism mean to me? Well, ecofeminism, the way that I have understood it and the way that I practice it is something that is based in care. It's a practice that is based in care. So care for yourself, care for your community, and care for your planet. So where you find yourself at the moment. Ecofeminism is more about practice for me than it is about theory. It's about how we go about implementing ideas about revolution, about intersectionality, about ecology, and how do we do that in community with one another. So I find myself not in the area where ecofeminism is very new agey, nor is it in the place where it's too academic and very much stripped of a lot of its inherent spirituality. I find myself somewhere in the middle, inspired by both, but also inspired by a lot of indigenous cosmologies, including my own. So for me, it's something that's really based in care and practice of that care.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting because actually I was looking for the word care and it didn't come up
It didn't, no.
on that screen. Interesting. Rachida, do you want to go next?
Sure, and I apologize in advance of always having to play the role of the hair in the soup. For me, the word ecofeminism tells me that there's a will. There's a will to do better, to do different, to make radical change, but that we're limited in conceptualizing what that means because we use a word that's actually not intersectional and not inclusive, but that sounds to me quite exclusive. Like, for instance, all those of us who do not identify as women are not mentioned within the concept, and I'm afraid that does not reach or does not have the aptitude of reaching this objective of intersectional organizing. So
Maybe just because we're going to talk a lot about intersectionality today. We'll show a video at the end explaining again what it means, but maybe to sort of kickstart the debate, what is intersectionality? How do you define it? Just, I know I'm asking for a lot of definition, but it's just to set the scene and so everybody's on the same page.
for me, the definition of intersectionality is actually recognizing that the systems of oppression are intersections, are connected to each other, and that's why also the lived experience of it, the discrimination part, is intersectional. And so, to me, we need to define concepts that acknowledge the intersection of oppression and not just that of discrimination.
Yep. Thank you. Joanna, same question for you. What's your definition?
Yeah, thank you. I think to start with, perhaps it's important to say what feminism is, right? And feminism is not some battle of the sexes or setting up men against women and ignoring non-binary or intersectionality. So I think it's important to say what feminism actually is. And it's an ideology, it's an analytical framework, but most of all, it's a platform for action. And it's a call for action for very radical social change, in fact. So it's concerned with dismantling patriarchy. So it's not concerned about building some kind of mythical matriarchy or saying that women are better than men. It's actually about understanding and dismantling systems of patriarchy, which are systems of coercion, oppression, control, and exploitation that try to rank us amongst each other and set us against one another. Men above women, different races and classes, but also humans above animals, above nature, as if we're separate from nature. So feminism is about dismantling that and replacing patriarchy with something else and something new. So it seeks to transform power, actually, away from coercive, controlling power to inclusive and transformative power. I'll talk more about power, I think, later in the conversation. I think, crucially, patriarchy, because it's unnatural, it sort of demands control over others, it actually means that violence is a central part of the patriarchal system. So violence is needed to maintain control over others. And so the violence against women, but also the exploitation of other people, the violence of colonization, of slavery, and also the extraction and violence against the planet and nature and animals is all part of that patriarchal system. And so that, for me, is what ecofeminism, why it's so important. Of course, it has to be intersectional, Rachida. It has to be not just about acknowledging the intersecting and forms of discrimination and oppression, but it demands that we act upon that as well, and that we act to overcome that we recognize the links between gender, sex, but also other forms of oppression, while not ignoring the fact that discrimination based on gender and sex still remains one of the most entrenched forms of discrimination, including here in Belgium. So ecofeminism looks at really transforming power. It's embedded in a new form and a new vision of power that's collective, that's inclusive, that's the power within us. And it's deeply concerned with care for ourselves, as Philsan said, care for ourselves, care for each other, and care for the planet. And perhaps one thing I just wanted to add, it rejects all of that violence as well. So the care is the opposite of the violence, but so is peace. And Greenpeace, you have it in your name. I think, you know, ecofeminism and feminist movements are deeply linked with pacifist movements as well. And I think it's important to say that up front.
Thank you, Joanna. Hopefully that sets the scene all right for everyone. You'll have opportunity for questions at the end. I want to go back to Philsan on ecofeminism, because that's a part of your work, right? And Joanna, you mentioned ACT, and it's true that today we talk a lot about ecofeminism, and I think today's panel is a testament to that as well. But we tend to talk a lot about it in different ways, right? There's the whole theoretical academic movement, right, that you mentioned in the beginning. And then there's also this new agey aspect of it that you mentioned in the beginning. So how do we move away from that? How do we move away from ecofeminism as just being a theoretical discussion or something trendy that, you know, we see on social media, to something concrete and practical, both in our everyday lives, but also from a power perspective?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
I think it is very much a theoretical conversation, especially depending on who is having the conversation and where the conversation is being had and what the goal is of that conversation. So is it to talk about ecofeminism and then think we've done our part for the planet for the day and pat each other on the back and then move on? Or is it a way for us to kind of use it as a framework to design some kind of praxis that makes the change and brings the change that we're trying to realize into the world? I think it's very important. Part of the question was that it is part of my work. It's not all of my work. There's so many things that inspire my work, and ecofeminism is one of those things, because I see the impact that can have on communities that I come from and ones that I identify with. And so it's for me a way of really, how do we use theory, right? Is it as a way to block mechanisms, or is it as a way to facilitate mechanisms? Who is talking about ecofeminism right now? Why are they talking about ecofeminism? And is it accessible, right? Is the language we are using to talk about the different oppressions that people are facing in conjunction with the way in which we are treating the planet a accessible sort of language, right? Is it something that anyone can understand, and is it something that then we can use as a framework? If it's not, then does it have any use then? Is it then just something that the powers that be and the structures that be can reappropriate, dismantle, remove any kind of revolutionary might or weight it might have to then just sell it back to us as part of a capitalist structure? So for me, I think what is really important is the places where we have these conversations, how we have them, and how we make the knowledge accessible. Because at the end of the day, everything we're talking about is really codified lived experiences of marginalized people. That's what we're doing. That's what we're talking about. And those codified lived experiences of marginalized people do not change and are not ended by us putting a term on it and then discussing it in universities or on panels. It's not changed by that. It's changed by us going into the field and creating community with one another and making our problems mutual problems. Your problems are my problems are your problems. This is praxis.
I feel like I want to follow up on that. It's not in the questions, I'm sorry, but I told you this might happen. We might go into different directions. Just very quickly, we live in a very difficult time for a lot of people. I mean, if we look around, the world is not going super well these days. And I know that's the million-dollar question, but maybe just a thought on how do we make sure that my problem are your problem when we live in a society that really pushes us to look inwards all the time, and it's super individualistic, right? I should care about my problem and my problem only. And then, of course, you have the system that makes it very difficult to have time to think about other people's problems, because when you come home from work and you have stuff at home. So, yeah, just maybe a super quick thought from the three of you on how do we make sure that we build that collectiveness back into our societies, and we start looking to other people's problems and make them our problems as well.
Well, I don't think that's going to be something that's easy, because the way
No,
the
of course.
structures are designed is to make it that we alienate not only from one another, but from the things that we produce. We are alienated from everything, including the planet. So what we're going to have to do is make choices, and those are going to be hard choices, and those choices are going to require us to invest time. They're going to require us to invest time in one another, because that is what is going to be necessary to build the trust that is necessary to build community. We are not going to do it just by coming together for small periods of time and then creating some real momentum in that moment and then dissipating back into the world. These structures have been around for a very long time, and they will make sure that you go back into your everyday life and back into that alienation. So you're going to have to really look at time as something that you try and win back. For me, it has become one of the most revolutionary things you can do on an individual level is reappropriate or
Reclaim?
Reclaim, thank you. Reclaim your time and how you use it and what you invested in. And it's going to be hard in the beginning, but we're going to have to do it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that resonates a lot. Rachida, thoughts on collective versus individual?
Yeah, I might want to make a distinction on collective when it comes to a global collectiveness, a global community, and the local. So in local lived experiences, like Philsan says, it's the locally grassroots lived experiences that get to be within these struggles codified, right? And ecofeminism grew that way. But it probably grew that way in some localities and not in others. Like, for instance, here on the ground, I know that in Belgium, in the last year or years...
Rachida, just maybe, I think your glasses are touching the mic quite a bit.
I was warned this could happen. Here within our local context, the organizations that are taking up this term and using it for now are white institutions. It's not a term that I have encountered in my grassroots experience here. But the grassroots experience here is also one that tended to be, the one I'm part of, is that tended to be intersectional because its components were intersectional. Like, we were black and brown and queer and concerned about the climate, and we wanted to smash capitalist patriarchy and so forth. And actually, it's while we were already organizing for a few years when, from a top-down perspective, we started to being called intersectional. So, and then there had to be, this choice had to be made by the people on the ground. Do we embrace that? Do we reject that? And now we are put again in that same position where we feel that we, the grassroots, are being asked to appropriate a term that is being proposed top down. And that's also, you know, my concern in terms of organizing community, grassroots level. How does that look within the context of using one concept that other people have other words for the same concept that tends to be inclusive, that tends to be grassroots and intersectional, but have ended up having other names? So the question would be, would that be okay? Would we start to communicate about them being synonyms? Or should we grow to a broader coupole, I don't know, umbrella concept that can, you know, take all these parts of it within itself? So yeah, that's the...
Yeah, and we'll go back to the, I mean, obviously you have an extensive experience of working at the grassroots level here in Belgium, so we'll go back to that as well, also because I think organizations like Greenpeace, but also others that are more institutional can really take a lot from your experience working with these different groups. Joanna, I'm asking you the same question, but I'm also following up with my following question, so I'm doing two in one. Which is about power, right? Because you have an extensive experience working at different levels of power, which is European or international. And a lot of people say that a feminist future or even an eco-feminist future can't happen within current systems of power that reciprocate, I don't know, I hope I said that right, harmful and exploitative patriarchal dynamics, right? I mean, maybe this is going to appear somewhere on the screen. You won't see it, but I'll describe what it says. Just putting more women in positions of power doesn't necessarily change things, right? I mean, we've seen it with Roberta Metsola, the new president of the European Parliament, who is a very strong anti-abortion. We've seen it with, Marine Le Pen, who is now one of the favorite personalities of French people, and we've seen it with Giorgia Meloni, who just got elected in the Italian election. So, women, for the sake of women in power, if they don't uphold feminist values, that's not necessarily a solution. So, how can an intersectional feminist future, not how, can an intersectional feminist future happen within the current systems? Or do we need to literally smash everything down and rebuild from the ground up, maybe, to build a system that actually works and where we can uphold these values and the things that we've started to talk about here today?
Yeah. I think you know the answer to that question, right? First to say, I think our concern should not be about seeking to get everybody to adopt a common identity as ecofeminists. I really agree with what Rachida was saying. I think this is about practice, and it's about how do we mobilize the most people towards our common vision of a world that is rooted in care for self, others, and the planet, and love in our real lived lives, and not that which we've been taught to devalue. So I really agree with that. We shouldn't be concerned and spend all our time in trying to adopt a common label for our work, but actually much more time in seeking what we have in common to work towards. So I really just wanted to underscore that before talking a bit more about power. And I said at the beginning that feminism's critical concern is about power and actually rethinking power. We still think of power way too much as the sort of traditional, hierarchical, coercive power, the power to make other people do stuff. That, as I said, is also seen as a kind of zero-sum game. So if I have more power, you have less power. And that embeds a kind of competitiveness and actually necessitates violence to maintain it. So feminism sees power as an infinite resource. So it's a completely different view of power. So we're not thinking about a pie, and if I have a bigger slice of pie, Rachida has a smaller piece of pie, and therefore we are in opposition. But actually it's a beautiful, sustainable vegan buffet that's endlessly being prepared by all of us, and it's delicious and it's wonderful. And why is it an infinite resource? It's because we seek to build power with others. So we seek to grow the collective power by unleashing the power we have within ourselves, the power of creativity, of courage, to work with each other, to have the power to make the change we want to make, the power for the future that we want to build. So it's a completely different concept of power, the power of transformation. And in it is also this sense of liberation, of joy as well, of curiosity as well, which I think is a super important concept that we all need to bring with us as we work collectively and collaboratively. We need to maintain curiosity. We can't come into spaces of collaboration knowing that we are right and everybody else is wrong. Right? We have to come constantly wanting to learn and unlearn and find that which we have in common that we often find is a lot more than we are told by the system. I think in terms of the question of individualism that you started touching upon, I think we have to remember that the system spends a lot of energy and money actually in trying to make us think that we are all individuals and we're not part of a collective. We think about the multiple billions and billions of euros that are spent advertising stuff to us that we don't need, making us feel that we're not enough, making us feel that we are individuals in competition with each other. It just shows how unnatural that is. It's natural for us to cooperate. That's what we do. We cooperate, we collaborate, we learn from one another. So yes, I hope that kind of starts to answer your question, that feminism is not concerned with just having more women. Women aren't all feminists. As I said at the beginning, it's not a battle of the sexes, and we don't get not too binary about it either. So it's not about just getting more women in leadership positions within toxic power structures. That's absolutely clear, because it's about ultimately transforming the systems and structures that are destroying the planet and making us all miserable, frankly, for no reason. So it's about rethinking decision-making and how we make decisions and who participates, whose voice we're listening to, who do we take seriously in our conversations, who are we curious to hear more about, and how do we do that? That said, it still matters, right, who's in power, right, in our toxic systems, right? It's still better to have some people in power than others, and it absolutely matters. Otherwise, you wouldn't be working on election campaigns, for example, over the next year or two. It still matters that there are women in our parliaments and women in our boards and women in leadership roles, because that's about ensuring there is representation of different perspectives. It still matters that we increase the number of underrepresented groups in decision-making and power. I was recently organised an event that was held at the Brussels Parliament, and we had a number of participants who were in wheelchairs or had different abilities. And there was no way for the particular person in a wheelchair to actually come and sit in any of the spaces where the deputies, the members of parliament sit. The building was accessible otherwise, which was at least something. But I said, well, what happens when your elected officials are in a wheelchair or have different abilities? They said that had never happened. So to me, it matters that those people are still, even in our systems that we recognize are not adequate, are still represented. But we need to be going beyond that, and we need to be looking beyond that. So it's about the tactics and the space we have, as well as the vision for transformation that we hold as well.
Yeah, and we'll go back into tactics and strategic decisions in a minute. But we live in a capitalist, patriarchal, profit-driven system. I think we can all agree on that. And we know capitalism and the growth paradigm, I can never say that word in English, paradigm, wow, yeah. Sometimes English doesn't make a lot of sense, undermines and devalues ecological process, but also care activities, right? Because they're not, they are unpaid labor, so they don't fit into the big GDP system, and we can't really monitor that. And the fact is, a lot of these activities are performed by women, right? So in the climate movement, we all often talk about system change, and we call for system change, but how can we ensure that this economic and cultural and political system change is feminist, actually, and takes into account the specificities around care, notably? And that's a question for you, Philsan, but also for all of you, because in a lot of the solutions that the green movement is pushing for, whether it's the traditional climate NGOs or the degrowth movement or the post-growth movement, whatever, actually some of the solutions that are pushed that are good for the climate or for the environment can be detrimental to women. And I just want to give a very concrete example. It's the 4 days week, right? The 4 days week is pushed as a solution because it saves emissions from transport to and back to the office, and for a lot of other reasons, obviously, because it gives people more time. But what it doesn't consider is that the care activities of children are often performed, more than often performed by women, right? And actually that giving women an extra sort of day off doesn't really change the rest of the week for them. So when you look at these solutions from a feminist perspective, what is usually said is that we should actually reduce the working day every day instead of granting one more day off. So yeah, how do we make sure that essentially these changes come from a feminist perspective, take that into account, and are not just, pushed as good solutions from just one perspective, which here is the climate environmental perspective, but are not at the end intersectional solutions?
The questions give.
I know there's so many sub questions to that.
The hard ones.
Sorry.
No, but I think Rachida and Joanna have also answered that, in that who has the power, where is the power located, how is the power being disseminated, for what use and what means is it being disseminated, and then of course how our grassroots movements that have always have to function outside of the system, how do they go about resource liberation? What are the things that we can learn about their emancipatory practices that can help us make these kinds of feminist solutions a reality? If the same group of people are always the ones consulted about the same questions and can only give you the same answers over and over again, then you will not have a future that is intersectional. You will not have a future that takes into account the grassroots and the people, the most marginalized people who are affected the worst by what is going on and all of the multi-layered problems that we have. Climate change is one problem, but there are so many of them, and they are made worse by one another. They are interlocked, as Rachida said, and therefore an intersectional perspective means that we have to look at it. The solutions we come up with have to be also interwoven as well, right? They have to deal with the different parts of the system simultaneously and as radically.
Yeah.
So how do grassroots organizations exist in these kinds of societies that have made it their business for marginalized people no longer to exist? There's no ifs or buts about it. The system is there to make marginalized people no longer exist, right? How do they make sure that they keep their communities? How do we uphold our communities? How do black and brown people uphold their communities? How do gender minorities uphold their communities? How are those intersecting identities, how do they all uphold their communities? And we can learn from those specifics. We can make sure that any conversation we have opens the doors to that, to everyone, right? And that is going to mean that the things we know and understand under a white supremacist system no longer work, right? And they're no longer welcome in that space, right? The knowledges that we deem important, the things that we value, are also a consequence of this idea, right? One of the inheritance of one of the consequences of colonialism is that we only think of one kind of knowledge as the right kind of knowledge. And like you said, do we come up with an umbrella term that takes into account all of these different synonyms, or do we just let the synonyms be for what they are? How do we take into account the different knowledge systems that exist, the different cosmologies that exist, and how do we learn from them? If that is not what we're going to do, then there's no reason to start the exercise in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
The reason why we are where we are is because a lot of people have been left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have been left out of the solution-making process.
Yeah, and Rachida, you work a lot at the grassroots level. I mean, probably almost exclusively with grassroots groups and with underprivileged groups. How do we make sure that in these search for solutions, not only to the ecological crisis, I mean, we're here at Greenpeace today, but in general, a lot of these solutions lie in these communities. How do we make sure that their voices are heard? And it's not just giving them a seat at the table for the sake of giving them a seat at the table. It's actually listening to the solutions and implementing those solutions. That is at the intersection of power and collaboration. But I would really like to hear your thoughts on this.
Here's some intersectional thinking. Who is the we you're talking about? What table are you talking about? What's at that table? Why would we, or who's the we that is invited at the table, and why would that entity want to be at that table? So before I can even answer that question, but what I would like to also add to your previous question of how do we make sure to take in account the condition, the consequences on women of these policies. I think it's important that that the way to do that is by not making this about women, but making this about all people that suffer consequences. Because actually making this about women perspective within my experience as a woman, queer woman of color here in the white West, is that it even excludes me. And what was I going to say? Yeah. and this sometimes I call myself the global South within the global North, just to call it like that. But actually, this also goes for European people and white people, because we could see in the latest news about Greta Thunberg that they were having an action against windmills because they were going to be built on indigenous people's grounds. I think that's the way to do it. I mean, we here in Europe, because when I hear you say we, for me, I identify that as a Western we, as a white we, as a European we. And I think that's where it all starts. Who is that we? How are we defining the we? And how are we
In the we.
relating
To the we,
ourselves to the we?
Lots of we's. No, should have said that. Oh, sorry.
Important aspect to the who's the we, because sometimes I find myself talking about we, but I'm not talking about the we people think I'm talking about. And it's not the we that I'm talking about, because the places that I am in active in, the communities I'm active in, does not look like what is in this room today. It looks like what you do on a grassroots level. That's what it is. These are the communities that I'm trying to uphold. These are the communities that we are talking about when we say that their lived experiences have been codified. So yeah, I think it was it's very clear. That is a very important thing to make clear. Who's the we we're talking about? This table needs to go anyway. So
Who needs a table, right?
Yeah.
different. No table.
Actually,
Sorry, go ahead.
Actually, I'm not as optimistic as you are in terms of the importance of representation.
True.
Maybe I used to be in a previous life, but then Thatcher happened, and
Then
we
what
got
happened?
really
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher?
Margaret Thatcher. I come from way back. It's when Margaret happened that I already got disillusioned about representation within this system. I think that it just sustains the status quo. That's my whole concern about the whole concept of feminism, right? It's that it's a reaction to patriarchy that defines two genders, and being feminist actually subscribes within that concept of two genders. So you're not addressing the original issue, which is the violence of gender binary, right? That's why also my concern is the fact that when you talk about feminism and you don't talk about white supremacy, that a lot of people will not be able to hear the message.
Yeah,
So I wanted to, if I can, say a little bit more about the 4-day week
sure.
example, because I think it's a really interesting one. And because it may seem like a great solution if you don't listen to different voices. So I really wanted to underscore what Philsan and Rachida were saying. Like, who's being listened to by whom? Whose perspectives are being taken into account? Whose lived experience is being taken seriously in forming these policy proposals? And who's forming the policy proposals anyway, I think, is a big question. Because the question, the example you gave here touches on some issues which are highly gendered, actually. So I would perhaps have a different perspective from Rachida on this. The issue of time, the issue of money, and the issue of work. So what is work, actually? And how do we define what work is? Because much of the work that women do, and it is still predominantly women, including here, that is not valued at all, right? That is not paid. First of all, women's work in the paid environment tends to be paid much less. Women are in paid work for less time and hours. And then the unpaid work that women do still remains much, much greater than the unpaid domestic work, childcare work, and care work that men do. And that is, if you take an intersectional perspective on that as well, and you look at pay gap, poverty, precarious work, and also low-paid care work, that where women of colour, migrant women predominate, I think that's really important sort of thing to think about what we mean by work to start with. So often we're thinking about work in a kind of paid with a contract kind of job situation, where actually feminism demands that we look at work in a very different way that includes all aspects of the ways in which we contribute to society, to our communities, to our households, etc., and looks to try and replace value on the care work and the work, the contributions that people bring, and particularly that women bring, that are so often undervalued, underpaid, and particularly the work of working class women, or of marginalized women, or of undocumented women, or migrant women. So, and then money comes into it as well, that great thing, money, because women still earn less than men, and the income gap in Europe, so not the pay gap, which is the difference between hourly pay on average, but the income gap, which is the difference in the amount of money going into people's bank accounts in Europe, is something nearly 40%, 40%. So women's income is about 40% less than men's income. We have the statistics on men and women, not on the non-binary, so that's why I'm quoting that, because that's where we have statistics. And that's why we still need those statistics, right, to say that is not okay. That is not okay. And then when we look at actually time, what we know is that time is like, we could have a whole other discussion about time and feminism, but time is a very interesting concept as well, and what it means, and how capitalism has defined time and the working week and the sort of filling of our time with activity and work and non-work. But I did want to say that women are much more likely to work part-time. In Belgium, 40% of women who work part-time, 40%. And only 10% of men work part-time in Belgium. So that's a massive disparity. And when you ask why women who work part-time give the reasons for why they work part-time, the vast majority of them work part-time. Why? To look after children or for other care roles, but generally childcare. When you ask men why they work part-time, they say it's because they haven't been able to find a full-time employment. So that just shows you we still have, whether we like it or not, within our system, we still have a highly gendered approach to money, to time, and to work. So if you're looking at something like a 4-day week, it really matters that you take into account that gendered perspective. It's called gender mainstreaming, which is actually a very radical concept from feminism that has become completely, as everything kind of sort of watered down, and actually isn't applied anyway in any circumstances where it would genuinely shift power. But it is at its core a radical concept. So it's about really thinking about the different impact on different people, different communities of a particular policy. Also, how you spend money, so how you raise taxes is a really important part of the question around the solutions, like the 4-day week. So where do the taxes come from? Who pays for who pays taxes? Whether that's on labour or on capital or on wealth makes a huge difference. And then all of those solutions, and particularly for women, and I think women really depend on excellent quality public services as well. So some of the other solutions you hear, like universal basic income, which is often super popular amongst the tech bros in California as well, which always makes me suspicious. So I think once they start embracing something, you're in trouble.
It's problems.
But maybe those ideas could work, right? The 4-day week and the universal basic income could work. But as long as we have a really great functioning public sector that understands the different ways in which different people relate to care, work, and time. And I mean that in a deeply intersectional way, because that is very different if you are a person with a disability, if you're elderly, if you are coming from a different background, ethnicity, if you're urban or rural. Those things all make a difference. But it's making policy as if people actually exist in the real world, and their real lives matter, and that means listening to those different perspectives that are too often marginalized.
Yeah, and I'm just flagging, there's a really good book about this, and you mentioned the importance of data, and there's this book called Visible Woman, which is all about how a lot of policies, including on climate, are negative towards women because they're not taken into account. Just before we wrap up, because we're getting close to the break time, and I'm guessing people might want to use the loo or just have a breather, I'm just going to ask you each to summarize, possibly in 1 or 2 sentences or in a very short time, this first part of this panel. It can be reflections, it can be questions, interrogations, reactions, angry comments, whatever you want. Anyone want to go first?
I would like actually to add something that can like summarize it, but that we haven't touched upon, and that's a concept called 7 Cheap Things. I don't know if you heard about it. It's a book written by Raj Patel, and 7 Cheap Things explains the history of the world through 7 cheap things. Care being one of those 7 cheap things. So there's cheap care, there's cheap labor, there's cheap nature, there's cheap energy, cheap money. Somebody else read the book and remembers. Cheap lives. So, and I think it's important to make the effort of linking in an intersectional way the cheap care to all those other levels. Yeah. That's when you have an intersectional perspective on cheap care, to whom most victims are women in our societies, but it's intrinsically linked to cheap labor, to cheap care, to cheap nature, cheap energy, and so forth. So that was a bit my summing up.
Joanna? Philsan?
Yeah, so I think what I would take from what we've already been discussing is not to get too hung up on definitions or trying to get everybody to wear the same label, actually, but rather think about how do we create spaces where we genuinely enter with curiosity and love, with the intention of collaborating towards common goals and finding the common ground. I know Rashida's going to talk a bit after the break about some inspiring examples of that here in Belgium. But really focus on where we want to get to, right? And focus on creating truly inclusive, joyful, hopeful spaces where people and different perspectives can be exchanged and we can learn from one another. Because I think that's what we need to really, often that's placed at the end of our plans. I guess you have great plans that you do in Greenpeace, and then at the end of it, we've got to make some time to listen to other people or to collaborate. Yeah. This has to be put right in the center, actually, and everything else flows from it. And it takes time, and it maybe it slows you down, maybe, but ultimately the impact and the joy and the kind of catapulting forward will make it worthwhile. And we need that now, right? We need to put all of our joy, energy, creativity, and power together in this moment in time to make the radical changes that are needed.
Exactly, and this is exactly what we'll be discussing in the second part. Yeah.
I have nothing to add.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. So we'll have a 10-minute break. So I'm looking at 52. I mean, I think I can safely assume that we can make it 13, if that's okay, just to allow people to, just have a drink, go to the toilet. And maybe we can launch the second question on the Mentimeter, if that's okay. And you guys can answer during the break, people online as well. It's on the leverages, right? So what are the different leverages to achieve an ecofeminist future? Is it money? Is it political will? Is it cultural awareness? Is it the grassroots level? Is it talking to your neighbor? It can be literally anything. Just share your thoughts and we'll use that to kickstart the discussion sorry, I'm taking time off your break. In 13 minutes exactly, we'll meet here again at 5:05. Thank you.
Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète? Greenpeace organise un défi sportif le 13 mai au domaine de Hofstad près de Malines. Course à pied, kayak, escalade, chaque membre de votre équipe pratiquera l'une de ces 3 disciplines. Alors n'attendez plus, inscrivez-vous!
Intersection.
Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète? Greenpeace organise un défi sportif le 13 mai au domaine de Hofstad près de Malines. Course à pied, kayak, escalade, chaque membre de votre équipe pratiquera l'une de ces 3 disciplines. Alors n'attendez plus, inscrivez-vous! Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète? Greenpeace organise un défi sportif le 13 mai au domaine de Hofstad, près de Malmö. Course à pied, kayak, escalade. Chaque membre de votre équipe pratiquera l'une de ces 3 disciplines. Alors n'attendez plus, inscrivez-vous! Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète? Greenpeace organise un défi sportif le 13 mai au domaine de Hofstad, près de Malmö. Course à pied, kayak, escalade. Chaque membre de votre équipe pratiquera l'une de ces 3 disciplines. Alors n'attendez plus, inscrivez-vous! Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète? Greenpeace organise un défi sportif le 13 mai au domaine de Hofstad, près de Malmö. Course à pied, kayak, escalade. Chaque membre de votre équipe pratiquera l'une de ces 3 disciplines. Alors n'attendez plus, inscrivez-vous!
Welcome back. I hope you had a productive or non-productive break. I don't know why I'm saying productive. Hopefully it was a restful break. Can we see maybe the result of the Mentimeter again? So to see what people filled. Ooh, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you back online the number, just in case you don't have it. And then we can leave another 30 seconds. So are people on their phone? Yes. So the code is 7308 6514. And the question was, what are the different leverages to achieve an ecofeminist future? And we have cultural awareness, repair connections, environmental justice instead of ecofeminism. That's an interesting one. Commons, deinstitutionalized care. Let's see. People in the room, feel free to add. Interesting. I don't see anything related to funding, for instance, which is something we discussed before. Or like even like policy changes. No, I don't want to influence people. Census. Education, yes, cool one. Voice of the problem, white feminism. We sort of touched upon this a little bit. Just give maybe 10 more seconds if people want to add. Oh, it's fine. It's also fine as it is. Some really interesting answers. The idea of the second part is to discuss collaboration, which is a big word and it could mean a lot of things. Radical system change, that's a cool one. The idea is that people who are watching this, whether it's you in person here or online, are really able to take away something that maybe they can implement in their organization, or if they don't work in an organization, in their work, in their fight. Because I'm going to be very honest, I'm in the green movement, I work for NGOs at the European level, and we're not doing a really good job at collaboration, even with each other, even with other green NGOs, we tend to not do a very good job. So I'm not even telling you, I'm sure you know, with other movements. That's a huge struggle. And it's very difficult, and it's a very difficult thing to crack for a lot of organizations. So I wanted to first ask you, Rachida, because you've been involved in many endeavors that were the intersection of culture, of migrant rights, of even environmental activism and movement. And you've made people that maybe didn't even talk to each other and collaborate with each other. And I think the latest example, maybe if you want to say a little bit about it, it's your current project, so the In My Name campaign. And what's your secret to collaboration? What's your recipe, sort of? But if you had to pinpoint elements, pinpoint a key few things that you think make collaboration between movements that maybe don't see eye to eye or don't work on the same thing work, what would they be?
I think for me the best way to answer that is by giving a concrete example on how it went on the ground with this actual campaign. It was last year. It was called In My Name, this campaign, and it was a law proposition for more humane and just migration policy. this year, I have a scoop for you all. It's going to be called Recognize in My Name. And this decision actually just fell yesterday evening, and it was a lot of hustle with all these big institutions to just, agree on a name for a platform. But how it started, so last year this was what we call the first concerned by the problematic that come together and define how they see their struggle. This was a first step of collaboration, which was a very difficult one to make because, as we know, under the actual policy, even the non-recognized people are set up against each other because they have different statutes, different, like one can maybe have some hope, the other one not at all, and so forth. So just to bring them together, regardless of where they have fled from and why they have fled from there, was like a whole lot of grassroots works to make that happen, knowing in what violent conditions they have to live and work and so forth. So we worked about 1.5 years on just that. So when that happened, and while doing that, we were during the campaign also addressing all these institutions from civil society to support their effort in their quest. And we had a lot of organizations actually that really supported them. Now in this second stage, towards the elections, the idea was to create a national platform that is that reunites what at this stage we're calling the first concerned with the concerned. That is undocumented people and all civil society organizations that are concerned by the question of asylum and migration, that have some kind of responsibility within these questions. Those are unions, those are organizations like Siré and Vluchtelingenwerk. So we brought those together in a first big assembly last year at the end of June, at the end of the campaign of In My Name, to tell them, look at what this common effort was able to produce in terms of making movement. Why don't we take it a step further and find a way to have not just the concern be together, the first concern be together, but also the concerned organizations. And a lot of these organizations had never worked together around these questions while they're all concerned by them. It's the dynamic, the grassroots dynamic that brought them together in this first assembly at the end of June. And now we're at the point where very soon, on 9 March, actually, we have our first big assembly to actually come out with this big platform and project. And what has been defined during the last months together, first concerned and concerned, is what do we agree upon? Let's put all that on a text and unite around that. How do we make sure we can show the multitude of support for this narrative without forcing people to join within one format, but keeping their autonomy and their identity. And so we really reflected on how do we enable that. And in the context of this campaign, the results is that, so to be part of this platform, of this national platform, you subscribe to the text, the consensus text about that we want a better life for refugees and migrants. So something has to be done on a political level to enable that. And to create a visual identity that everybody uses to make sure that we can see that this is one movement, but every entity gets to organize totally autonomously, but under that same visual identity. So why did I use this example? It's because there can be a million examples, basically. I think this is proper to this dynamic and what happened on the ground when you centralize the first concerned in your dynamic. And I think maybe that's the way to start thinking on all types of collaboration. Collaboration, yes, but with a condition. You centralize first concerned of violence. And in our case, why we choose this topic is maybe an important to end this part with. For me, that's because migrant rights is really the last big civil rights movement to be to be had. So that's why we think that in a bigger scheme, it's important to centralize that. So.
Yeah. I have so many follow-up questions. The first that brings to mind is, I feel like this is something that the Green movement has recently started doing, you know, a little bit, like putting the voices of the people on the front line, you know, really sort of centralizing the voices of the most affected by climate breakdown. But there's still so far to go, because at the end of the day, when you look at people who work in those organizations, they're not on the front line of climate breakdown. You know, I mean, none of us probably are in this room. I mean, there's been floods in Belgium a year ago, but I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but that a lot of people that were affected by the floods do work in green organizations. So there's a massive gap here before we do that work of centralizing. And my question is that because this is the grassroots level the best level to do that? And maybe it is that organizations like NGOs that are more institutionalized are not ready for this, or do not have the ability to do that centralizing step. That's my question. So is the grassroots level the best place? Or is it that there are stuff that we can do, but we're really not doing them well?
I believe that creating these strategies, grassroots level is the only place where it's even possible, right? On an institutional level, I think the story can be different from one to the other institution. Namely, is the institution top-down or bottom-up? Is it a colonial institution, or is it really a people's institution, regardless of it being white or being gendered? You know, there's a lot of intersections to be taken in account in each institution to find out about what are the possibilities within this institution to be inspired by grassroots, to connect to grassroots, to let themselves be taken up by grassroots. But that would be, for me, the idea behind the dynamic, right? It's not just how can institutions implement intersectional thinking and policy, because institutions cannot do that. I don't believe that. But the question should be, how can institutions implement grassroots knowledge of intersectionalism, grassroots experience, local grassroots experience, intersectional experience?
And you think they can?
I think there's a lot they can do. To start with, empowering, you know, creating space for them, enabling. I mean, when I talk about In My Name, I'm coordinating these national structures with all these institutions in it, with all kinds of representatives, directors, I'm doing this for free because there's no money for this. But the only reason this was possible is because somebody was doing it for free. So there's also a...
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of things to be addressed to enable even a dialogue between institutions and grassroots, I think.
I want to turn to Joanna, because in your work, in your career, in your years of working, you've collaborated with loads of groups at different levels. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the same question, you know, also the grassroots perspective, but also when you manage to sort of get that collaboration started, what do you do when you don't see eye to eye? Because while I understand that we need to center the commonalities, what happens when you get to a point where the differences also become very strong? Like, I don't know, differences in tactics, in strategic choices, in fundraising routes, maybe if we get to, you know, that point. What happens? Because this can happen, and this can bring a movement down. So what do you do? I guess, first of all, same question, and then what do you do when those differences start to maybe clash a lot between these organizations? How do you still center that commonality?
I really agree with Rachida on the need for this to come from, for a lot of the radical change that we want to see. And in thinking and in dreaming about the world we want to live in 10 years' time, that's the most urgent question we have to all face right now. We need to draw from grassroots, from real experiences of people. I think perhaps a difference with the women's movement is that women's movement is made up of people with the lived experience of gender discrimination, of violence, of sexual harassment, of rape, of economic violence, etc., including here in Europe, right? So it is already very connected. But I think we want to really think about and remain focused on the big changes we want to see and not get distracted. Because I think we're very quickly distracted by the latest crisis. Everything is a crisis. Now it's apparently polycrisis. Is that a word you use here in Greenpeace? Yeah, it's the latest buzzword. But everything's a crisis, and we always have to be reacting to the crisis. And that's what our enemies really want, because that puts us in panic. It puts us in competition. It detracts our resources away from where they need to be very often as well. So we need to, I think, create spaces and time and put resources into keeping the long-term vision in sight. And that's where we can find a lot in common. So both in the day-to-day organising and the doing stuff together, which builds trust, which builds connection, which builds community, and also in holding the threads of a common vision. That doesn't mean we have to agree on every part of that vision. We don't have to write it all out. We don't have to agree to every way of doing, of every way of being, of every tactic, of every word and language. Because that we can spend a lot of time and lose a lot of time. But we do need to create time and space to build trust, to build community, to build common action, which helps us build relationships. Because at the end of the day, it's relationships that also drive these movements for change. I think that means really being, in my experience, I've had a lot of experience of trying to collaborate, trying to build collaborative movements at European level. And I'd agree with you, Chloe, that there's often also a lot of competition at that level, competition for space, for voice, for who's being heard and who's getting to speak on this panel, or we all rooted in those patriarchal ideas of power and which table is being invited and sat at and so on. But we get drawn into those things as well, right? Because we're human beings and we're also part of those systems. So there's a massive issue, I think, about ego that doesn't get mentioned very much in our movements. And how do we let go of ego, and actually how do we even recognize it in ourselves? I think that is exacerbated by a culture of overwork and of heroism, and the work we're doing is so important, and I am so vital to that work that I have to work more and more and more until I can no longer even understand the balance in my life or what's going on around, or even speak to my neighbors. And I think that is, we underestimate how toxic that is. For us creating collaborative movements and spaces for collaboration. That's what I've seen. So what does that mean we need to do? We need to actually take, and I'll speak particularly perhaps about the women's movement, which I've spent a lot of time in and working in and leading, if you can call it that. Anyway, certainly participating in. For example, and I think it's important to say that here, the lack of resources. Rachida mentioned it now. Most of the work of the women's movement is done voluntarily or for free or for very little money. When I was working at the European Women's Lobby, we had like the smallest budget of any of the movements at European level. We didn't even have as many people, and it's the European Women's Lobby is the only organisation that pulls together representation of the women's movement at European level. And we had less people and less money than even the Greenpeace EU office, right? Let alone all the other environmental organisations, or even, I would say the others who had as little money as us would be the European Network Against Racism. So classically, those two movements, under-resourced, depending on free work, depending on passion of people. And so I think it's important if an organisation with power, resources and money like Greenpeace wants to think about collaboration, you have to recognise your own power. The power of your brand, of your money, of your people, of your international reach, of your reputation, and recognise that those you want to collaborate with might not have the same kind of resources. So that means perhaps thinking of new ways to resource or create space for those collaborations. It means hiring people who are good at that kind of collaboration or come from those movements and know those, have those networks, those ways of seeing, being open to new tactics and ways of being, and looking for that common ground. And I think focusing on the common ground, having some shared values, some shared vision, some common ground, and this is where we operate. And this is how we behave in that space. I think that's often not talked about enough as well, the inclusive behaviours. And then if you're not but able to behave like that, then you're not welcome in that collaborative space. I think coming at spaces with a sense of curiosity and hope and a willingness to learn is critical to any kind of collaborative working as well.
Yeah. The bit about funding really resonated because in the work that I'm currently doing with the organization, we realized that so many of the groups we wanted to work with are completely underfunded. And so now in our application bids, there's a whole bit which is about subgranting, because we realized that otherwise there's no way that we can actually work with these groups. We can't just go to them and be like, hey, we've got a really cool thing that we would love for you to get involved, but for free. Yeah, that doesn't work.
But then you have to be careful about the relationship of donor and grantee,
of course,
right? Because that's another power relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
So how you make that money, are those resources available?
Yeah.
What you expect in return?
Exactly.
What kind of reporting requirements you place on those organisations that then can't do the work that you love them for?
Because if you bury them under paperwork, and then they have to hire someone just to do the paperwork. It doesn't make any sense, of course. Just sort of on collaboration, but also reaching out. I mean, Philsan, when we first met, you mentioned the struggle that some people have to identify with organizations such as Greenpeace, for instance. And do you think that work that several NGOs, including Greenpeace, are doing, trying to unlearn, unconscious biases and talking about other struggles than just their own, for instance, do you think that could change that lack of identification with these NGOs? Is that even wantable? No, that's not an expression. Is this something that we would want to see? Is desirable? That's what I found. Is it needed? Is that desirable? Or do you think it's not actually necessary?
It's not necessary. I did not grow up here. I came to this country in 2007. I am from Somalia. And a very, very concrete example of how climate change is affecting my country at the moment is there are prolonged droughts now. And Somalia is more than 80% agriculture-based economy. There's also been a civil war that has been going on, that has been exacerbated by the consequences of colonialism since 1991. And people who lived in more places that are farther away from the capital city were really more or less quite peaceful in their day-to-day lives. But climate change has made it so that they have to leave those spaces now because they can no longer provide for their families and go to where it's dangerous. Because of that, then they end up leaving the countries. They end up fleeing, if they even get to flee, because most people don't know about the fact that most refugees end up in neighboring countries. More than 80% of them end up in neighboring countries, and very, very few actually end up in Europe or in the West. And you will have generations of people who are born and will die in refugee camps. And when they do get to Europe, they are put in more precarious situations considering how they got here. Was it the legal way or was it the illegal way? And if they're in a precarious situation when they're here, it means that they are more susceptible to more of that violence, the continued violence. And these are the ways in which climate change and all the other problems are very much interlinked. I am a product of that system, and I never felt like Greenpeace ever spoke to me, and it has been around for longer than I have been alive, right? And I don't think it's also desirable that it does speak to me. I think the work that you do is there and it's necessary. What is desirable is that the resources that you are able to galvanize, the ways in which you are able to use the platforms that you have as an internationally recognized entity or organization to support and to help organizations like In My Name and other grassroots organizations already doing the work that is specifically generated towards their communities in ways that only they will understand intrinsically and does not require an extra education, then that is what you should be doing. I feel like the part of doing the unlearning processes, that's okay, you can continue by all means. Do not stop. But there needs to be very many different things happening at the same time. The unlearning and trying to change the organization from within and all of that needs to be happening while the supporting and the upholding of these organizations that are doing the work that you want to be doing in the future today. That's what you should also be concentrating on at the same time, I think.
Yeah, and Rachida, going back to a very concrete example on this, In My Name was supported by Greenpeace in the past and maybe still is. How do you see the future of collaboration between the Green Movement and migrants' rights movement or anti-racism movement? How do you see that moving forward? Is that type of collaboration something that could inspire other organizations? Or do you think it should be done in a very different way? Do you think how do we multiply?
Well, I
impact?
hope not to see it moving forward as an entity, but just I hope to see it merge with intersectional grassroots practices as a whole movement. You know, what we said about the word feminism for me goes also for the eco in front of it, you know, obviously. So, yeah, I think collaboration now should, like Philsan said, be investing in grassroots, and the future should be working towards, you know, merging all this institutional power into empowerment of grassroots intersectional work as such, meaning, you know, climate, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and to finally address that as what it is, namely one struggle and not just, you know, different struggles next to each other.
Working in silos as well.
Yeah.
I have two sort of collective questions next. The one is we discussed the leverages, and it's sort of the same question, but also on levels, you know, because we talk a lot about the grassroots versus the institutional. What's the leverage / level that we should really focus our effort to make sure that what we've been discussing here really happens in the future? So is that money? Is that funding? Is that the critical things that needs to be addressed now? Not necessarily in 10, 20 years, but now. Is that space that doesn't exist in organizations like this now and that needs to be better done? Is that we actually 5 steps before that and we still need the awareness raising because some people might not understand? What is critical to you today to make sure that change is actually implemented? Rachida, do you want to go first?
Money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Money. I mean, after organizing for 30 years, I can say I believe we're finally in a place where the merge of this, you know, different silos, it has come to a maturity, you know, in the recent past, there's been the hashtag #MeToo movement, there's been Black Lives Matter movement, and then this with the climate movement and so on. It's coming to a maturity, and I see that the possibility of it is there. The options are there. The leverage created by grassroots work is there, but no way to capitalize on it because we don't have the means for it.
So money.
Yes.
Funding. Joanna?
I mean, yes. Firstly, I completely agree. I think if I could address some advice to Greenpeace, perhaps, I think you need to be really clear on your purpose of doing this work. So being really clear, like why do you want to go beyond? Why do you want to see and be part of this intersectional, this different kind of movement? Or why do you want to provide space and resources for that? Because if you're not clear and crystal clear about why you want to do that, you're always going to think it's on the margins of what you do. And it will always be pushed to the end of your plans and the budgets and it won't be in the core of your business of what you're doing and your decision making, your resources. So I think that's, if it's not clear already, would be where I would encourage you to put some energy. I said it already, within that, understanding your own power and what you bring and what that means for others you engage with. So being clear then about who you want to be engaging with, how you want to engage, being very conscious of what you bring into those spaces and how you can squeeze out the space for others. So that means being really, truly open to collaboration, knowing that it will change you as it may change those you collaborate with. So co-creating of spaces, not saying, here's our vision, come and join us, but co-creating and being genuinely open to that, allowing things to happen. I think for the funding part and for the collaboration work, that means really building trust. We don't talk about that enough, but that also means investing in that kind of trust building and the time to build trust. And building those listening skills as well. So that means, it might mean also who you actually hire and who you want to have within your board or your staff who bring different perspectives and can challenge. And then I think just finally, I really would urge you to rethink your very idea of leadership, actually, and what leadership means. I think we still have, and I'm afraid I still think that organizations like Greenpeace have a kind of white hero male idea of leadership that I think I've already expressed I don't hold, and I think it doesn't reflect the truth of who is bringing change in the world. It ignores the stories, it ignores the reality, the lived experiences, the knowledge that Philsan talked about of those who are truly bringing the change each and every day, who don't define as ecofeminist or eco or feminist, but are mobilizing indigenous movements, who are women smallholder farmers who are going about their stewardship of the land in a different way, who are garment workers, who are making the clothes that we all throw away, who are often also women and underpaid. So I think really rethinking our ideas of leadership, and I would urge you to look at the concepts of feminist leadership, which come from women's movements from the global south, which really urge us to rethink power, to center care, to build systems for collaboration and inclusion, and deeply inclusive processes as well. So I think, money, purpose, your own power and understanding that, rethinking your ideas of leadership, and actually building systems and space and time for the kind of curiosity, the trust building, and the relationship building with other parts of other movements into this great merger of a movement that Rachida dreams of.
Thanks, Joanna. Philsan?
I think we can learn a lot from the natural world when it comes to collaboration, because we think a certain way, and when I say we, I mean white supremacy structures think a certain way about competition. The same structures then go about thinking that the natural world uses those same paradigms. So I'll give you an example. Susan Simard is a Canadian scientist, and her work is very much based in indigenous cosmologies. But had it been said by an indigenous person, you would probably not hear about it. But she's done a lot of work on how networks are created within the natural world. And she comes from a certain area in Canada that was very biodiverse. But throughout the years, it was getting less and less biodiverse for the purposes of consumerism and capitalism, and very large swaths of natural areas were being completely stripped of any kind of diversity, and there was only one kind of tree left. The idea being that the lush forest was in competition with one another, so the trees were in competition with one another, and therefore anything that could come out of there was not something that could be consumed to the maximum level. So we are going to just have one kind of tree. It ended up being a disaster and completely ruining the area, and it was necessary for there to be years and years of kind of work done to rejuvenate it. But what what her work showed us, that was of course based in indigenous cosmologies, was that these trees and this biodiversity, the way that it was creating networks. So the larger trees were protecting the smaller trees that were growing from the sun. They were exchanging resources so that they could feed each other. The mushrooms were feeding the soil to keep it fertile and to keep it lush. And these are things that did not occur to the white supremacist structures, because white supremacy only functions from a place of domination, from a place of destruction. Mm-hmm. And they ended up kind of ruining the area, and by extension, a lot of places that were like this. So what we can learn from the natural environment is how to go about building those kinds of networks that feed each other, that make sure that that there is space and there is place for all kinds of diversity to be viable, right? Bell Hooks writes about it but the importance of networks in a small, tiny little essay called Home Place, where she talks about the home, the place that is historically a place of that has been dominated by the feminine presence, that these places were where the revolutions were born. They were where they were fed. They were where they were kept safe. It was the work that was being done in these areas that made sure that networks existed that could kind of protect people when it was time for the system, the judicial system, to come after what was being done on the street, right? It had to happen first there before it kind of seeped into the street. So in her essay, she's also talking about how we can go about making sure that we can, even in those very small areas of impact, can create those kinds of networks that are then in conversation with one another, right? The railroad, Harriet Tubman, that was also another kind of very important result of that kind of networking. She actually could read the trees. She read them. She could see what side the moss was growing on, so that she knew which way north was. This is what I say when we do not value certain kinds of knowledges, we miss so much, right? When we remove ecofeminism, when we remove spirituality and the things that marginalized groups that we ended up calling the global majority, because that's what they are, we miss so much of this information. We let it go, it dissipates, it loses so much of its revolutionary praxis, it loses so much of its way of creating mechanisms that can bring about the change that we want, right? So I would go about it by not trying to have the natural world mirror us, but us mirror the natural world.
Thank you, Philsan. That was amazing. And I'll definitely, I'll ask you for the name of the book again, because I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one interested. I'm realizing I should have asked that Menti question before I ask you that, but it's fine, then we'll do it the other way around. I have a question for you, so both the audience in the room and people online. It's, I mean, you've heard multiple elements of answer, so maybe try to be creative and think outside of what was just said. But what does the Green Movement have to do to ensure that other struggles are taken into account and intersectionality is the norm? Do you want me to repeat the question? No? The code, yeah, very practical question, yes. 7308 6514. I'll give everyone a minute to reply. And then we'll move on to questions. So stay on the Menti, because then you'll be able to ask questions on there for about 10 minutes. I I said think outside the box. Like this is literally Rashida's answer. Give power to grassroots. Learn how to listen. I'm sure someone's going to say just what they said. What they said. Degrowth. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, degrowth as well.
I don't know, maybe also look at the green movement as something that's not just happening in this part of the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work going on everywhere else, and it's very valuable work.
Yeah. Look elsewhere. Working towards more diverse staff and volunteers. This is what you were saying about representation. Maybe just a few more seconds.
Well, inclusion.
I forgot about the definition video. Yeah, well, maybe we can put it after. Yeah. Make sure that we integrate the different perspectives in our work. Throw white saviorism in the trash. Yeah. Maybe just a few more, and then we have a quick definition video about what intersectionality means, just in case we need a reminder, because we've been using that word a lot. Support other movements without necessarily expecting something in return, to show and embody a truly collaborative spirit instead of only. Earn marking sufficient budget to support for intersectional grassroots. Yeah, this is about funding. Give power to the most affected and support them in any way possible. Yeah.
Maybe one term I would like to add, because I didn't hear it yet, I think, it's urgency.
Urgency.
And to include the urgency, the lived urgency of victims of climate challenge and catastrophe right now, and not just those we might live in 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. And so that, but there's been not enough, but there's been a change in the narrative recently, in the recent years, about, well, like the narrative of for our children and our grandchildren to, no, this is like now, and people are already dying now.
Yeah.
Can we maybe play the video? But I don't know if people in the room will.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that, and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that, to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Vous avez envie de bouger pour la planète?
Oh, that was. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now we'll move on to questions. So if you can use the same Menti link, I will give you the number again. And feel free to ask questions either directly to a specific panelist or generic question, and then we'll see who wants to take it. Do you have the code, or do you need it again? Should I give it again, just in case? Yeah, it's a pretty long code. 7308 6514, and you should have the possibility to ask questions. Okay, so let's see if people have questions. Let's maybe give it a minute. Otherwise, I have plenty of other questions. But I know it takes a bit of time sometimes to pop up on the screen. no questions? I mean, that must mean you have been incredibly clear, and we were incredibly clear for the past 2 hours, and there's no questions. I mean, feel free to ask them as they come. We have about 7 minutes left. Otherwise, I mean, now I have to sort my thoughts. Yeah, go ahead.
Just thank you for sharing that video, which is Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an American law professor who coined the phrase intersectionality. And I think it's really important to hear directly from her and to acknowledge where that comes from. Again, we often do not acknowledge women's leadership, particularly women of colour. And I think it's important that we heard her voice directly in today's exchange. And particularly, I've heard over the last year or so, a lot of people using the term intersectional when they actually mean diverse, which is not the same thing. So often actually what people mean is there should be more representation of people of colour, which is a valid thing to want and to seek, but it's not the same thing as intersectionality. And so you also referred to one of my comments as being about representation, whereas I would talk much more about inclusion. And so what does inclusion mean? That means obviously not discriminating and not exploiting people in your volunteer group or in your workforce, for example, in a workplace. But it's also acknowledging the ways in which different forms of discrimination and exploitation intersect, as Kimberly Crenshaw was saying. Not just acknowledging that, but being prepared to take action around that. So that means understanding and dismantling bias. It means lifting barriers that exist to people's full participation. It means, yes, zero tolerance to discrimination, sexual harassment, racism, which, I mean, it feels like I shouldn't have to have to say that, but I do still have to say that because too many of our organisations still have those forms of discrimination and violence happening within them as well. So I just wanted to make that distinction between representation and diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality.
Which are super often used
interchangeably.
Yes, that's the word, interchangeably. Well, we had one question before. I don't know if anyone specifically wants to take it. Is, do you believe in white woman leadership?
I don't believe we should exclude white women from leadership, if that's what you mean. But I'm trying to think about a different kind of model of leadership entirely. And I think that's part of this conversation, which is about rethinking power, which is about building collective power, which is about acknowledging, actually, that where change is coming from, which is about working on unleashing the power within ourselves and not drowning that out in toxic overwork spaces and culture, and that includes parliaments and political systems. And so for me, in that sense, we should all be participating in leadership in different ways. Certainly don't think we should be excluding white women from leadership, nor should we be saying that white women are necessarily better leaders than white men, but we've obviously had less of a chance of proving that. There's some obvious examples that Rachida came up with of women in leadership roles who haven't exactly done great things for our causes and for a better planet, but there are also white women in leadership who have done. I'm thinking about Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, who embodies for me a kind of intersectional, eco-feminist approach to leadership.
I would like to answer that too, if that's okay. To me, actually, when I see white women, whiteness is a systemic construct. So is gender. That person doesn't exist to me. And that's what we should go towards, right? Either we really, it took me, for instance, years and years of unlearning to rethink myself and my condition outside of the systemic identity boxes that are created top-down to identify me, that have nothing to do with me. Are you the person that believes that? Are you the person that want to enable grassroots indigenous practices to build alternative systems that don't exploit, that don't discriminate? Then you should be leading. And your race and your gender should not be defined top down. You should, to me, that's what really is lacking within going to a post-white supremacy and a post-gendered society and a post-capitalist society. That's maybe another thing I want to add. Within, for instance, with the word ecofeminism, what I also feel is that there's a taboo to address capitalism and there's a taboo to address white supremacy, and that's why we choose ecofeminism. I think there's another need there to, tackle those taboos.
Address the issues, the
Yeah.
root issues. Philsan, I don't know if you wanted to react to this one.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that both race and gender are a construct. They're part of a structure, and what we need is people to betray the structure. So betray whiteness, betray gender, betray all the other systems of oppressions that hold themselves up. So, yeah.
Can we just go back to above, please? Above. Again. There was... this is one. I think it was. To Rachida and Philsan, utopia is a concept which is created by white men, which was created during the beginning of colonialism. Jesus. Is the idea of a perfect ecofeminist world helpful, or is it part of a white supremacy culture?
First, I would say. And you would say the latter?
That's...
Is the idea of a perfect ecofeminist world helpful, or is it part of a white supremacy culture? I'm guessing, so the link with the first part of the sentence, as it was created by white men during the beginning of colonialism.
Utopia, the idea of utopia, yes. This idea that there is... Utopia for me is not a place where we have equity and justice for all. I feel like that is something that is basic and everyone should have, and that should not be the utopian ideal. The utopian ideal is past that, right? If we can even call it a utopian ideal in the sense that it still plays into those structures. Ecofeminism, on the other hand, and this is my issue. Like the idea of bringing certain concepts and then defining them within the Western world, and then thinking the Western world was the only place where these kinds of things existed. No, boo-boo. That's not how it works. Like ecofeminism is something that came up around the world at the same time. It is a global inheritance. This is not something that Western society can take claim to. No, it's really, really not, right? One of the biggest inspirations for ecofeminist thinking was the Chipko movement. And those were women in India trying to take care of their communities. They did not think about the word ecofeminism. They were thinking about how to take care of their communities and how to take care of the land that was taking care of their communities, right? Whiteness does not have a monopoly on knowledge. It does not have a monopoly on epistemologies. Whiteness does not have a monopoly on these things, right? They belong to all of us. They belong to all of us. And yes, the structures of white supremacy have created all these oppressions, indeed. But we have to honor the work that is done by people of color and it's done by indigenous people and black people to coin these terms, to explain their reality, to explain their material reality. And in the context in which that they were coined, they might have issues because they might have left out some things, but that does not mean that we cannot engage with it. It's not holy text. We can engage with it. We can change the meanings, right? We can build upon their work. They did not do this work so that it can stay untouched. They did the work to explain the realities they found themselves in the context they found themselves in the times they found themselves in, and we can use it as an inspiration to build from that. So ecofeminism is not Western, and I will never, ever, ever let anyone call it that.
I have a final question, which I feel like is a...
To me, I would like to add something to that, but when the concept is used in a top-down manner by a white institution in the West world, it has a completely different connotation to me than when you explain what it is. Because in my reality, this concept, I feel, is being shoved into my face top down by people who are afraid to tackle the inclusion of white supremacy and capitalism together with that of ecology and feminism. That's what I hear, experience, and feel when the concept, because maybe what we can say is that it's an indigenous practice, codified. Ecofeminism is an indigenous, ancestral practices that are codified, but as many other things, are taken over by white institutions to fit into their white dream.
Yeah. Yes, this is the function of white supremacy structures. It is to take revolutionary ideas away from the people who come up with them, and to strip them of any kind of meaning and substance and weight, and then to sell it back to us as pop feminism or this thing that we can buy into. Yeah. What our job then is to reclaim it, is to continue to be loud about what it is and what it is not, and whom it is for.
I think this is actually the perfect conclusion, so I'm not going to ask that last question also because it relates to stuff that we've been discussing. It's 6 and we still have to conclude, and I want to make sure that we sort of stay on time because we have things to do and we don't need people to stay at work until, I don't know what time. So just if we can do a big round of applause for all these amazing speakers. I really hope, and I'm sure it was helpful. And can you hear? Yeah, and I'm going to give the floor back to Valerie for conclusion. And I also wanted to really thank you for hosting this event today and creating that space to have those conversations within your organization. Thanks. Yeah, and thank you, Chantura, as well. I would give you this, but I feel like maybe it's a bit of a hassle. Very close. I mean. Shall I start with, people here can hear me, but maybe not on the... I think it's working.
Okay. Yes, thanks to the panel for the amazing conversation. I benefited a lot. I have a bit of stress to conclude and say the things that have resonated the most. It might not be very coherent, but I wrote down a few things which really resonated. I think definitely the definition of ecofeminism in the beginning, that it's not a dividing thing, it's a platform for radical change. I think that resonates with all the true Greenpeace fans. Like we want to be a platform for radical change and to change the system that is oppressing nature, that is destroying nature and treating the planet as a commodity that is also oppressing all these other people. And I think that's also one of the things, like, okay, today it's ecofeminism. I can assure the panel behind me, but this is one of the entry points that we're using. We're not focusing on ecofeminism because we don't want to talk about racism. We're trying to talk about everything, but showing the different angles and how it's all connected together. That's part of the why that we are doing this, the connection between this topic, between racist topics, between what we are traditionally, what we have been traditionally doing. So to see that connection, to talk about that connection, and to find the common solutions, I think that's a big thing of the why, and that's what really resonated. The transformation to being more collective and inclusive. definitely important, and how to listen. I think that's, for me personally, a challenge, but definitely also for organizations like Greenpeace, who in the past, we were, an organization showing up as heroes with all the solutions there. We are not used to, and we are trying to learn. And I'm also, like, we're not starting from zero. We have been trying to do this for a few years, but we're not completely there. How to show up for other people, how to listen, how to put the people that we claim we're fighting for, the most affected, really at the center of what we're doing, and really showing up and listening. It's not so easy. We have to unlearn a lot of things. It also resonated that while we're learning this, we talk a lot at Greenpeace. We have to build the train while it's moving, because we are in a sense of urgency. The planet's on fire, like the biodiversity crisis, mass extinction. It's all true. What really resonated with me is what you said, is be revolutionary and reclaim your time and focus on the things that are really important. I think that's for us sometimes inside the organization, but also in the world, something that is important. And it's difficult, because I also hear you say it's urgent and people are suffering now. So how do we take that time and to do the work that we need to do to show up, to really listen, to reform ourselves, and at the same time also be impactful and do the work that we need to do? I heard we can start by supporting others who already know what to do. That's the lesson I also heard today. Okay, I know that this is all not very a consistent story. I'm just telling some of the things that really resonated with me, and I think I'll stop here.
I forgot to thank him.
Yes, I thank you very much to Shanturu, who is really the inspiration for this day, who is our tennis officer, who brought us a lot of knowledge about all these themes, and who is also really organizing this. So thank you, Shanturu, as well. And I guess that's the end of our show. Thank you all.